Welcome back to Shadow Trail Files. I'm your host, and today we're diving deep into the shadowy heart of America's most infamous hiking trail, the Appalachian Trail. Before we begin, if you're new here, we document the strange, the terrifying, and the unexplained from America's wilderness areas. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss a story. Story 1. My name is Warren Carter, and I've spent most of my adult life exploring remote wilderness areas across the United States. By the fall of 2021, I had logged thousands of miles on trails, crossed mountain ranges in every season, and camped alone in places so isolated that seeing another human being was almost impossible. That's why I felt completely confident when I planned a 5-day solo trek through a little-known section of the Appalachian Mountains near the Tennessee-North Carolina border. The weather was perfect. The leaves had turned brilliant shades of orange and gold, and the forests looked like something out of a painting. The first 2 days were uneventful and peaceful. I spent my mornings hiking through endless ridges, my afternoons photographing overlooks, and my evenings sitting beside a small camp stove, listening to the sounds of the forest. On the third day, while studying my map during lunch, I noticed an old trail branching away from the main route. It wasn't marked on newer maps, but an older guidebook I carried mentioned an abandoned fire lookout tower somewhere deep in the mountains. Curious, I decided to find it. The trail quickly became overgrown, forcing me to push through dense brush and duck under fallen trees. After nearly 3 hours of hiking, I finally spotted the tower standing on a distant ridge. It looked ancient, leaning slightly to one side, as if decades of storms had slowly twisted it. As I approached, something immediately felt wrong. The forest was silent, completely silent. No birds, no insects, no wind moving through the trees. The silence was so unnatural that I stopped walking and simply listened for a moment. Then I noticed something even stranger. There were footprints in the mud leading toward the tower. Bare footprints. The problem was that the temperature had dropped below freezing the night before. No sane person would be walking barefoot through those mountains. Still, curiosity pushed me forward. I climbed the rusted stairs to the top of the lookout and found the observation room empty except for layers of dust and broken glass, but scratched into the wooden wall beside one of the windows were dozens of names. Some looked decades old. Others appeared fresh. As I examined them, I noticed the same sentence repeated over and over in different handwriting. Don't answer if you hear your name. I actually laughed when I read it. It sounded like the kind of local legend teenagers tell around campfires. After taking a few photos, I left the tower and continued toward my planned campsite several miles away. Darkness arrived faster than expected, and by the time I pitched my tent, I cooked dinner, crawled into my sleeping bag, and eventually fell asleep. Sometime after midnight, I woke to the sound of someone calling my name. Daniel. The voice was distant, almost hidden among the trees. I sat upright immediately. The voice sounded like a woman, soft, calm, almost familiar. At first, I assumed another hiker needed help, but then I remembered I hadn't seen another person all day. A few minutes passed before I heard it again. Daniel! This time it sounded closer, My heart began pounding. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside the tent. The forest was pitch black. Nothing moved between the trees. The voice stopped the moment I emerged. Feeling foolish, I searched the area for several minutes and found nothing before returning to my tent. About 20 minutes later, the voice returned. Daniel. It was now much closer, close enough that it sounded as if someone was standing just beyond the tree line watching my campsite. Every instinct told me not to respond. For some reason, the warning carved into the tower wall suddenly flashed through my mind. Don't answer if you hear your name. I stayed silent. The voice called again, then again. Each time it sounded slightly closer. Eventually, it seemed to be circling my campsite. One moment it came from my left, the next from behind me, then directly in front of the tent. Yet I never heard footsteps, never heard branches breaking. Nothing. Just my name drifting through the darkness. This continued for nearly an hour before everything suddenly stopped. Exhausted, I eventually fell asleep. At sunrise, I packed my gear as quickly as possible and prepared to leave. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Surrounding my tent were footprints. Hundreds of them. Bare human footprints pressed into the frost-covered ground. They formed a massive circle around my campsite, looping around and around throughout the night. But none of them entered the camp itself, and none of them left. The tracks simply ended at the edge of the forest, as if whoever had made them had vanished into thin air. I didn't take photographs. I didn't investigate. I threw my pack on my shoulders and hiked out of those mountains faster than I've ever hiked in my life. Even now, years later, I still can't explain what happened that night. But sometimes, usually when I'm half asleep, I hear a voice in dreams whisper my name from somewhere deep among the trees. And every time it happens, I remember the warning scratched into that abandoned lookout tower high in the Appalachian Mountains. Don't answer if you hear your name. Story 2. The first sign that something was wrong wasn't the scream. It wasn't the footprints, the missing backpack, or even the fact that nobody ever found the man who disappeared. The first sign was the photograph. I know that sounds strange, but if you had seen that picture, you'd understand why 27 people refused to go back into that section of the Appalachian Mountains ever again. My name is Ryan Mitchell, and in the summer of 2018, I joined a volunteer search and rescue team, helping locate a missing hiker near the Appalachian Trail in Virginia. The missing person was a 34-year-old man named Jason Reed, who had been hiking alone and was reported overdue by his family after failing to check in for nearly a week. At first, nobody was overly concerned. Delayed hikers are common in the Appalachians. People get lost. Equipment breaks. Weather changes unexpectedly. Usually they're found within a day or two, but this case was different from the very beginning. Jason's vehicle was discovered at a trailhead, exactly where it should have been. His route was well documented. His gear was modern and reliable. Yet he had seemingly vanished, without leaving behind a single clue. Hundreds of volunteers joined the search effort. Helicopters flew overhead. Canine teams swept valleys and ridges. Rangers checked every shelter and campsite within miles. For 3 days, we found absolutely nothing. Then, on the 4th morning, one of the teams located Jason's backpack sitting upright beside a large boulder nearly 6 miles away from the main trail. It looked as though someone had carefully placed it there. Nothing was damaged. His food was untouched. His water filter was still inside. Even his wallet remained exactly where it should have been. It made no sense. Why would an experienced hiker abandon the one thing containing everything he needed to survive? While investigators examined the backpack, one ranger discovered a camera tucked inside a side pocket. Everyone assumed it would finally provide answers. Maybe photographs of an injury, evidence of where he'd gone, something useful. That afternoon, the memory card was reviewed. Most of the pictures were completely normal. Mountain views, wildlife, sunsets. Then came the final image. The room went silent the moment it appeared on the screen. The photograph had clearly been taken at night using a flash. Jason appeared to be standing inside the forest, breathing heavily, based on the blur in the image. Directly behind him, between 2 trees, was a figure. Human in shape, but impossibly tall. Its body looked unnaturally thin, almost stretched. The flash reflected off what appeared to be pale skin, but the most disturbing detail was its face. There wasn't one, just smooth darkness where a face should have been. At first, everyone assumed it was a trick of the light. Maybe a tree stump, maybe a branch creating an illusion. But when investigators enhanced the image, they noticed something terrifying. The figure wasn't standing behind Jason. It was much farther away, at least 70 yards into the woods, which meant it should have appeared tiny in the photograph. Instead, it towered above the surrounding trees. Some volunteers refused to look at the image again. Others joggled nervously to hide their discomfort. The search continued, but strange things began happening almost immediately afterward. Radios started cutting out in specific sections of the forest. Searchers reported hearing footsteps matching their pace despite nobody being nearby. Several people claimed they saw a tall silhouette standing between trees, watching them from a distance. Whenever anyone approached, it disappeared. On the 6th night, while our team camped near a ridge overlooking a valley, we heard what sounded like someone calling for help. The voice echoed through the darkness. It sounded exactly like Jason. Every search and rescue volunteer is trained for situations like that, so several of us immediately grabbed flashlights and moved toward the sound. The voice continued, calling from somewhere below us. We followed it for nearly 20 minutes before one of the team leaders suddenly ordered everyone to stop. The voice was still calling for help, but we realized something horrifying. It wasn't getting closer, no matter how far we walked. It remained exactly the same distance away the entire time, as if whatever was making the sound wanted us to keep following it deeper into the mountains. We returned to Gand, to camp shaken, but unwilling to admit how frightened we actually were. The next morning, we discovered dozens of footprints surrounding our tents. They were far larger than normal human footprints and appeared barefoot. Despite temperatures cold enough to make that impossible, none of us had heard anyone approach during the night. 2 days later, the official search was suspended. Jason Reed was never found. The photograph remains the only real clue investigators ever recovered. Maybe there was a logical explanation. maybe there still is. But I know one thing. A year after the search ended, I attended a gathering of former volunteers. Someone brought a copy of that final photograph. As we studied it again, one of the volunteers noticed something none of us had seen before. Hidden among the trees, scattered throughout the darkness behind Jason, were dozens of identical faceless figures staring directly toward the camera. We counted 11 before nobody wanted to keep looking. Story 3, I didn't believe the stories when I first heard them. Every small town near the Appalachian Mountains seems to have its own legends. Ghost, hikers, strange lights, mysterious disappearances, things people swear they saw deep in the woods. Most of them can be explained away if you look hard enough. At least, that's what I thought before the summer of 2022. My name is Tyler Brooks, and at the time I was working as a wildlife photographer, documenting remote sections of the Appalachian wilderness. I spent weeks alone in the mountains chasing photographs of black bears, elk, and anything else I could find. Being alone never bothered me. In fact, I preferred it. The deeper into the forest I went, the more comfortable I felt. That confidence disappeared during a 7-day trip into a remote area of eastern Kentucky. On the second day, while hiking along an old logging road that no longer appeared on modern maps, I found something unusual. Nailed to a tree was a weathered wooden sign. The paint had mostly faded away, but a few words were still visible. It read, "If you hear knocking after dark, stay inside your tent." Underneath, someone had carved a second message much more recently. "It knows when you're awake." I laughed, took a photo of the sign, and continued hiking. By late afternoon, I reached a small clearings beside a creek and decided to camp there for the night. The forest around me was dense and quiet, with steep hills rising in every direction. As darkness settled over the mountains, everything felt perfectly normal. I cooked dinner, reviewed photographs on my camera, and climbed into my tent shortly after 10 p.m. Around midnight, I woke to a sharp knocking sound. 3 knocks, slow and deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. At first, I assumed a branch had fallen somewhere nearby. Then it happened again. 3 more knocks, this time closer. The sound wasn't coming from a tree. It sounded like someone striking wood together. I listened carefully. Several minutes passed before another series of knocks echoed through the darkness. Knock, knock, knock. The sound seemed to be moving. Each time it occurred, it came from a different direction around my campsite. I remembered the sign I'd seen earlier that day and felt a sudden wave of unease. For the next hour, the knocking continued. Sometimes far away, sometimes so close. It sounded as if it was just outside my tent. Yet whenever I looked through the mesh window, I saw absolutely nothing. Eventually, the sound stopped. I convinced myself it had probably been an animal and drifted back to sleep. The following morning, I noticed strange marks in the mud surrounding my campsite. They weren't footprints exactly. They looked more like long grooves, dragged through the dirt by something heavy. The tracks led into the forest and disappeared among the trees. Curious, I followed them for a short distance before deciding it was a bad idea and returning to camp. The rest of the day passed without incident. I spent hours photographing wildlife and exploring nearby ridges. By sunset, I had almost forgotten about the knocking altogether. That night, however, things became much worse. Around 1 a.m. the knocking returned. 3 knocks, then silence. 3 more knocks, then silence. But this time there was something else. Footsteps, slow footsteps crunching through leaves. They circled my campsite just beyond the reach of my flashlight. Every few minutes, the footsteps would stop, and 3 knocks would echo through the darkness. Then the walking would continue. The pattern repeated for hours. I didn't sleep at all. Just before dawn, everything suddenly became quiet. The moment sunlight touched the trees, I crawled out of my tent and immediately froze. Less than 20 feet away stood an old wooden cabin hidden among the forest. My heart nearly stopped. I had spent 2 full days in that clearing and never seen any cabin. It should have been impossible to miss. The structure was large, weathered, and partially collapsed. Yet somehow it seemed to have appeared overnight. Thinking exhaustion was affecting my judgment, I approached cautiously. The front door hung open. Inside, I found dust, broken furniture, and signs that nobody had entered for decades. Then I discovered a notebook lying on the floor. Most of the pages had rotted away, but a few remained readable. Every entry described the same thing: knocking outside at night. One page ended abruptly with the words, "It's standing outside now. It wants me to look." There were no further entries. Suddenly, I heard a knock. 3 sharp knocks from somewhere deeper inside the cabin. I didn't wait to investigate. I grabbed the notebook and ran. I packed my gear within minutes and started hiking back toward the trailhead. As I left the clearing, I glanced over my shoulder one final time. The cabin was gone. The spot where it had stood was empty forest. No ruins, no foundation, nothing. I stopped walking and stared in disbelief before convincing myself the trees were playing tricks on my eyes. But when I reached home and reviewed my photographs, I found something that still keeps me awake at night. Mixed among my wildlife pictures were 6 images I never remembered taking. All 6 showed the same clearing at night. In every photograph, my tent was visible beneath the moonlight. And standing at the edge of the trees, watching it, was a tall, dark figure holding what appeared to be a piece of wood. In each image, it was slightly closer than before. The final photograph was taken just a few feet from the tent door. To this day, I have no memory of taking those pictures, and I have never gone back into that section of the Appalachian Mountains to find out what was knocking in the dark. Story 4. The recording was never supposed to exist. If the battery had died 10 minutes earlier, nobody would have heard it. If the camera had fallen a few feet in a different direction, the entire thing would have been lost forever. But somehow, it survived, and after listening to it myself, I understand why some people refuse to hike certain parts of the Appalachian Mountains alone. My name is Ethan Walker, and in 2020, I worked as a volunteer assisting search teams in remote wilderness areas. Most calls involved injured hikers or people who simply lost their way. The case I'm about to describe was different. It started when a 26-year-old backpacker named Connor Hayes failed to arrive at a scheduled pickup point. Along remote Appalachian Trail in West Virginia, Connor was experienced, physically fit, and familiar with the area. According to friends, he had planned a simple 4-day hike. When he missed his pickup time by nearly 2 days, authorities launched a search. I joined the effort on the 3rd day. Hundreds of acres of forest were covered, but there was no sign of Connor. Then, late in the afternoon, one of the teams discovered his campsite. At first glance, everything looked normal. His tent was still standing. His sleeping bag was inside. His food supplies were untouched. The strange part was that Connor himself was nowhere to be found. It looked as if he had simply stepped away and never returned. While investigators examined the site, a ranger found a small action camera lying beneath a bush about 30 yards away. The battery was dead, but the memory card remained intact. Everyone hoped the footage would explain what had happened. That night, several members of the search team gathered around a laptop to review the recordings. The first few hours were exactly what you'd expect. Connor hiking trails, filming mountain views, talking to the camera about wildlife and weather conditions. Then came the final recording. The timestamp showed 11:47 p.m. Connor was inside his tent, whispering into the camera. He sounded nervous. He explained that he'd been hearing someone walking around his campsite for nearly an hour. As the recording continued, faint footsteps could be heard outside. Slow, deliberate, crunching through leaves. At one point, Connor unzipped the tent and pointed the camera into the darkness. Nothing was visible beyond the beam of his flashlight. The footsteps immediately stopped. A few minutes later, they returned. Then something happened that made every person in that room fall silent. A voice called his name. Softly, calmly. Connor! The voice sounded close, much too close. Connor whispered that he was completely alone and hadn't seen another hiker in over 2 days. The voice called again, this time from a different direction. Connor. The camera shook as he turned toward the sound. Then another voice spoke from somewhere behind him. Same tone, same volume, same exact words. Connor. There were now at least 2 voices, maybe 3. The recording captured nearly 20 minutes of this. Voices calling from different directions around the campsite. Never shouting, never threatening, simply repeating his name. Eventually, Connor decided to leave the tent and investigate. The camera view became unstable as he walked into the darkness. Trees passed through the flashlight beam. Branches snapped beneath his boots. The voices continued ahead of him, always just far enough away to remain unseen. Then, suddenly, Connor stopped moving. For several seconds, nothing happened. The camera pointed toward a patch of darkness between the trees. When he finally spoke again, his voice was barely audible. "What is that?" The flashlight beam trembled violently. At first, nobody reviewing the footage could see anything unusual. Then, one of the investigators paused the video. Deep in the background, partially hidden behind a tree, stood a figure. Human-shaped but impossibly tall. Its head nearly reached the lower branches overhead. It wasn't moving. It was simply watching. Connor must have seen it too, because his breathing became rapid. The footage showed him backing away slowly. Then another figure appeared to the left, then another, shapes emerging silently among the trees. The camera suddenly dropped. The image spun across the forest floor before coming to rest facing upward. Connor could be heard, running, branches breaking, leaves crunching, then a scream, a single terrified scream that cut off abruptly. After that, there was only silence. The camera continued recording for another 40 minutes. Nothing moved. Nothing spoke. Then, just before the battery died, a shadow passed directly over the lens. For less than a second, the camera captured something leaning down toward it. The image was blurred and distorted, but it appeared to be a face. Not a human face. Something pale, stretched, and wrong in ways I still can't properly describe. Connor Hayes was never found. Neither were any clues explaining what happened after the recording ended. Officially, the case remains unsolved. But what disturbed me most happened months later. Investigators enhanced the final frames of the footage and counted the figures visible among the trees. There weren't 3, there weren't 5, there were 17. 17 silent figures standing in the darkness, watching Connor long before he ever realized they were there. Story 5. I wasn't supposed to be on that mountain. In fact, if a thunderstorm hadn't forced me off my original route, none of this would have happened. My name is Jake Morrison, and in September of 2021, I was hiking alone through a remote section of the Appalachian Mountains in Western Virginia. I had planned a simple 4-day trek along a well-established trail, but late on the second afternoon, a powerful storm rolled in much faster than forecasted. Dark clouds swallowed the sky. Temperatures dropped and rain began falling so heavily that visibility shrank to almost nothing. Knowing I couldn't safely continue, I searched for shelter. That's when I found the cabin. It stood on a ridge hidden among thick trees, so overgrown that it looked like nature had spent decades trying to erase it. The structure appeared abandoned, but it was solid enough to keep me dry for the night. The door hung slightly open, and after calling out several times and receiving no response, I stepped inside. Dust covered everything. Broken furniture sat scattered across the floor. Judging by the condition of the place, nobody had lived there for years. As strange as it felt, I was grateful to have a roof over my head. I built a small fire in the stone fireplace and settled in for the evening. While exploring the cabin, I noticed something unusual carved into the wooden wall beside a window. There were dozens of tally marks scratched into the wood, grouped in sets of 5. Hundreds of them. Beneath the marks, someone had carved a sentence: "Don't look outside after midnight." I remember laughing when I saw it. Every abandoned place seems to come with some creepy message left behind by previous visitors. I took a photo of it and thought nothing more about it. Around 11 p.m., the storm finally ended. The forest outside became perfectly still. I sat near the fireplace reading until I started feeling tired. Then, at exactly midnight, 3 loud knocks echoed from somewhere outside the cabin. I froze. The sound was clear enough that there was no mistaking it. Someone had knocked on wood, 3 slow knocks. Then, silence. I waited several minutes, expecting to hear footsteps or another sound, but nothing happened. Eventually, I convinced myself it was a branch falling somewhere nearby. 20 minutes later, it happened again. 3 knocks. This time they sounded closer, much closer. as if they had come from directly outside the cabin wall. I stood and moved toward the nearest window. That's when I remembered the message carved into the wall, "Don't look outside after midnight." The thought made me hesitate for a moment before common sense took over. I peeked through a crack in the wooden boards covering the window. At first I saw nothing except moonlit trees. Then movement caught my attention. Standing at the edge of the clearing was a person, or at least I thought it was a person. The figure was extremely tall and unnaturally thin. It stood perfectly still facing the cabin. I couldn't make out any details because of the darkness, but something about its proportions felt wrong. I watched for several seconds before stepping away from the window. My heart was racing now. I told myself it was probably another hiker, maybe someone seeking shelter after the storm. Yet the figure hadn't moved. It hadn't waved. It hadn't called for help. It had simply stood there, staring at the cabin. About 10 minutes later came another 3 knocks. This time from the front door. The sound nearly made me jump out of my skin. Knock, knock, knock. I grabbed my flashlight and approached cautiously. "Hello?" I called. No response. "Do you need help?" Silence. After several moments, I slowly opened the door. Nobody was there. The clearing was empty. The forest beyond stood silent beneath the moonlight. I stepped outside and swept my flashlight across the trees. Nothing. Then I noticed footprints in the mud. Bare footprints, large ones. They led directly to the cabin door. But there were no tracks leading away. I slammed the door shut and pushed a heavy table against it. For the next several hours, I sat beside the fireplace listening. Every 30 or 40 minutes came another series of knocks. Sometimes on the walls, sometimes on the roof, sometimes directly against the front door. Always 3 knocks. Never more, never less. Just before sunrise, exhaustion finally got the better of me and I drifted into a light sleep. When I woke, daylight filled the cabin. Everything was quiet. Relieved, I packed my gear and prepared to leave. Before heading out, I decided to take one last photograph of the strange tally marks on the wall. Later that evening, after reaching my vehicle, I reviewed the images on my camera. Most looked normal. Then I opened the photo of the tally marks. My stomach dropped instantly. Standing in the window behind me was the same tall figure I had seen outside during the night. The problem was that the photograph had been taken hours before the storm arrived. Nearly 6 hours before I had even entered the cabin. I checked the timestamp repeatedly, convinced there had to be some mistake. There wasn't. Somehow, the figure appeared in a photograph taken long before I ever knew the cabin existed. To this day, I still have that image stored on an old hard drive. I've shown it to experts, photographers, and investigators. Nobody has ever explained it. And no matter how many times I look at it, one detail always stands out. The figure isn't looking at the camera, it's looking directly at me. Story 6. The map should have been my first warning. Not the strange sounds, not the missing people, not even what I eventually saw in the darkness. The map. Looking back, everything started with that map. My name is Nathan Cole, and in the fall of 2023, I decided to spend a week hiking through a remote section of the Appalachian Mountains in eastern seas. I had downloaded several trail maps before leaving and planned every detail of the trip. As someone who spent years backpacking alone, I believed preparation could prevent almost any problem. On the second day of the hike, while resting at an old shelter, I noticed something tucked beneath a loose floorboard. It was a folded paper map, yellowed with age and covered in handwritten notes. Most of the markings didn't match any official trail system. Strange symbols had been drawn across ridges and valleys, along with short warnings written in faded ink. One note caught my attention immediately. Beside a narrow valley, someone had written, "If you hear whistling after sunset, leave." There was no explanation, no signature, just those 6 words. I remember shaking my head and assuming it was some local legend. I folded the map, slipped it into my backpack, and continued hiking. By late afternoon, I reached the valley marked on the map. It was beautiful in a haunting sort of way. Steep mountains rose on both sides, blocking much of the sunlight even during the day. A shallow stream wound through the center, and enormous trees covered the slopes like a wall of shadows. It felt isolated, but that was exactly what I wanted. I set up camp near the water and spent the evening cooking dinner while watching fog gather between the trees. As darkness settled over the valley, the forest became unusually quiet. No birds, no insects, nothing. Then, sometime around 8 p.m., I heard it. A whistle, one clear note drifting through the darkness. At first it sounded far away, almost pleasant, like someone hiking nearby, trying to get another person's attention. I listened for a few moments, and then returned to what I was doing. 10 minutes later, the whistle came again. Same note, same tone. This time it sounded closer. I stood and scanned the forest with my flashlight, but saw nothing. The whistle continued every few minutes throughout the night. Always a single note. Always slightly closer than before. Around midnight, I realized something disturbing. The whistle wasn't moving through the valley. It was circling my campsite. One moment it came from the north, the next from the east, then directly behind me. Yet I never heard footsteps, never heard branches snapping. Whatever was making the sound moved silently. And I was too nervous to sleep. Every time the whistle sounded, it seemed to come from just beyond the reach of my flashlight. Then, something changed. A second whistle answered the first one from somewhere farther up the valley. The two sounds began alternating back and forth like a conversation. One whistle, then another, then silence, then another exchange. My stomach tightened. There was something deeply unsettling about the pattern. It didn't sound human anymore. It sounded coordinated, intentional, as if two unseen things were communicating in the darkness. The exchange continued for nearly an hour, before abruptly stopping. The silence that followed felt even worse. I eventually drifted into a restless sleep shortly before dawn. The next morning, I discovered footprints surrounding my campsite. Not animal tracks, human footprints, bare footprints. Dozens of them pressed into the soft ground. Some were larger than normal, others appeared strangely narrow and elongated. They completely encircled my tent. Yet none of the tracks entered the campsite itself. It was as though whoever made them had spent the entire night walking around me, without ever stepping closer. I should have left immediately. Instead, curiosity got the better of me. I remembered the old map and decided to follow several of the handwritten markings deeper into the valley. After a few hours, I found something I wasn't expecting. Hidden among the trees stood the remains of a stone structure. It looked ancient, far older than anything that should have been there. Most of the walls had collapsed, but a few still stood. Carved into one of the stones was a symbol identical to one drawn on the map. Nearby, scattered across the ground, were dozens of small piles of smooth river rocks arranged in perfect circles. The place felt wrong. The air seemed heavier somehow. While exploring the ruins, I noticed fresh footprints in the mud leading into the forest beyond. The same elongated, barefoot tracks I'd found around my tent. Against my better judgment, I followed them. The trail eventually climbed a steep ridge before ending at the mouth of a narrow cave hidden behind thick vines. Standing outside the cave, I heard something that instantly made my blood run cold. Whistling, not from inside the cave, from behind me. I spun around and saw a figure standing among the trees about 50 yards away, tall, thin, completely motionless. Before I could react, another figure appeared farther down the ridge. Then another. Then another. None of them moved. None of them spoke. They simply stood there watching. I turned and ran. Branches tore at my clothes as I sprinted through the forest. Several times I thought I heard footsteps behind me, but I never looked back. By sunset, I had reached the main trail and continued hiking until I found other people. Only then did I finally stop. Months later, while researching the area, I discovered something that still bothers me. The valley where I camped had a reputation among locals, dating back more than a century. Old records described hunters hearing unexplained whistling at night before vanishing without a trace. Several disappearances had occurred there throughout the years. Most were blamed on accidents, but one detail appeared again and again in witness and accounts: whistling in the dark. Sometimes one ussill, sometimes two. And according to the oldest stories, if you ever heard 3 whistles answering each other from different directions, it meant you had already been found. Story 7. I still don't know what I was thinking when I agreed to take that job alone. Maybe it was pride. Maybe I wanted to prove I could handle the Appalachian backcountry without backup. Or maybe I just didn't believe the warnings people kept repeating about that specific stretch of wilderness. My name is Caleb Morgan, and in 2024, I was hired to help inspect and repair a series of old weather monitoring stations scattered deep in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia. Most of them were simple maintenance work: replace batteries, check antennas, collect data logs. Nothing dangerous on paper. The 7th station was the last one on my route, located far off any marked trail. According to the coordinates, it sat in a heavily forested basin, surrounded by ridges on all sides. The access path was barely visible, more suggestion than trail. By the time I reached the area, the sun was already dropping behind the mountains. The GPS signal started cutting in and out, but I eventually found the station. An old metal structure, half swallowed by trees and vines. It looked abandoned, exactly as expected. I parked my gear, stepped out, and immediately noticed how quiet it was. Not normal quiet, The kind of silence that feels like something has been removed from the world rather than absent from it. No birds, no wind, no distant insects, just stillness. I unlocked the station door and stepped inside. Dust covered every surface. The equipment was outdated, most of it probably not functional for years. Still, my job was simple: verify the log and replace the power unit. As I worked, I noticed something strange, written in marker on the inside of the metal cabinet. It wasn't part of any official labeling. It looked recent. The words were simple: "Do not stay after dark. It listens when the wind stops." I remember pausing for a moment, then shaking my head. Probably a prank from some bored technician, I told myself. I finished my inspection faster than expected and stepped back outside just as dusk settled over the basin. That's when I realized I had misjudged the situation. The wind had stopped completely. The air was dead still. Even the trees looked frozen in place. I checked my watch. 7:41 p.m. I decided to start hiking back immediately. But as I packed my gear, I heard something from the forest edge. A faint mechanical click, then another. Like metal shifting under pressure, I shined my flashlight toward the trees. Nothing moved. 10 seconds later, the station behind me made the same sound. Click. I turned sharply. The building was still. Then the sound came again, this time from the roof. Click. As if something heavy had stepped onto it. I backed away slowly, trying to convince myself it was thermal expansion. Old metal reacting to temperature change. But then, I heard a third sound, this one much closer, right beside me. From the radio equipment I had just finished checking, a voice crackled through the speaker. Not static, not interference. A voice, calm, low, clear, still here. I froze. I hadn't touched the radio since finishing the maintenance. The voice repeated, slightly louder. Still here. I pulled the battery immediately and stepped away from the station. The moment I did, the forest responded, not with movement, but with silence deepening further, as if even the idea of sound had been removed. Then the clicking started again, multiple directions now. Trees, metal, ground, like something moving around me without footsteps. I started walking fast, then jogging, then running. I didn't stop, even when the trail disappeared. I just kept moving downhill, through darkness and branches, until I finally hit a paved road hours later. I never went back to verify what happened at Station 7. Officially, the logs showed nothing unusual. No signal anomalies. No audio recordings. No maintenance errors. But when I checked my body cam footage later, there was one thing that didn't match the report. At exactly 7:43 p.m., 2 minutes after the wind stopped, the camera captured a single frame of the station door, slowly opening behind me. The problem is, I was standing outside the entire time. Story 8. I don't tell many people this story because it sounds like the kind of thing you hear from someone who spent too much time alone in the woods and started losing their mind. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And I know I never went back after that night. My name is Owen Blake. And in early 2025, I was part of a small geological survey team mapping sinkholes and cave systems in the Appalachian Mountains of eastern Kentucky. We were stationed out of a temporary base camp near an old logging road, and each day we'd split up to survey different points before returning, before dark. On the fourth day, I was assigned a solo grid section near a ridge that wasn't on any modern maps. The area was supposed to be stable, but satellite images suggested unusual underground formations. My job was simple: take readings, mark coordinates, and return by sunset. The hike up was uneventful, but the higher I climbed, the more I noticed something odd about the terrain. The ground felt hollow in places, like stepping over empty space buried beneath layers of soil. At one point, I found a narrow crack in the earth, maybe 3 feet wide, stretching between two boulders. Cold air was rising from it, just air that felt older somehow, stagnant and wrong. I marked it and continued. By late afternoon, I had finished my readings and started heading back down when I heard something faint below me, in the valley. At first I thought it was wind passing through the trees, but the sound repeated, a low, uneven rumble, like something scraping slowly against stone. I stopped and listened. The sound wasn't random, it was rhythmic, deliberate, almost like movement underground. I checked my radio, but there was no signal. That wasn't unusual this deep in the mountains, but it meant I was completely alone. As I stood there, the rumbling stopped. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. Then, from somewhere behind me, I heard my name. Owen! I spun around immediately. Nothing. No movement. No birds. No wind. Just trees. I called out, thinking maybe another surveyor had wandered off course. No response. I started walking faster, trying to get back to the main trail, but the forest seemed unfamiliar now. Landmarks I was sure I had passed earlier looked different from how I remembered them. That's when I noticed the ground again. The soil beneath my boots was vibrating slightly. Not enough to feel at first, but once I focused, it was unmistakable. Something was moving under me. Not fast, not chaotic. Slow, controlled, like it knew exactly where I was standing. Then the rumbling returned, much louder, this time followed by something I will never forget. A sound like stone grinding against bone, deep beneath the earth. I froze as the ground a few feet ahead of me cracked open. Not explosively, slowly, as if something underneath was pressing upward with patience. I backed away as dirt and small rocks began to shift and fall inward. From inside the opening came a sound, breathing, not human breathing, too deep, too layered, as if multiple lungs were exhaling at once. Then I heard my name again, but this time it didn't come from behind me or the forest. It came from inside the ground. I ran. I don't know how long I ran, but I remember falling at least twice, cutting my hands on rocks, barely feeling it. The rumbling followed me for what felt like miles before finally fading behind the ridge. When I made it back to camp, I didn't speak to anyone. I packed my gear in silence and left before sunrise. Later, when the rest of the team finished their section, they reported no anomalies in that grid area, no cracks, no sinkholes, nothing unusual at all. But I know what I saw open in the ground that day, and sometimes, when I'm somewhere quiet enough, I still hear it. Far below everything, moving slowly, waiting patiently, as if it remembers exactly where I stood. Story 9. Most missing person cases begin with a mistake. Someone takes a wrong turn, ignores the weather, underestimates the terrain, or pushes a little farther than they should. At least. That's until the summer of 2024. After what happened in the Appalachian Mountains that year, I stopped assuming every disappearance had a logical explanation. My name is Aaron Mercer, and at the time I worked as a volunteer with a wilderness recovery team that assisted local authorities in searching for lost hikers. We'd handled dozens of cases over the years, and while some ended tragically, most eventually made sense. This one never did. It started when a college student named Michael Foster disappeared during a weekend backpacking trip in a remote section of the Appalachian Mountains near the West Virginia border. According to his friends, Michael was experienced, physically fit, and familiar with the trail system. He had planned a 3-day hike and carried enough supplies to stay out even longer if necessary. When he failed to return, a search operation was launched. By the 4th day, I joined one of the volunteer teams assigned to sweep several valleys north of the main trail. The area was rugged, heavily forested, and rarely visited. During the first 2 days of searching, we found nothing. No footprints, no discarded gear, no signs of injury. It was as if Michael had stepped off the trail and vanished into thin air. On the 3rd day, one of the searchers discovered something unusual. Hanging from a tree branch, nearly 8 feet above the ground, was Michael's compass. There was no damage to it, no indication it had fallen or been thrown. It looked carefully placed there, as though someone wanted it to be found. A few hundred yards farther, another team located his backpack. Like so many strange cases in the Appalachians, the pack contained nearly everything: food, water filter, first aid supplies, extra clothing. Nothing appeared stolen, nothing appeared damaged. Yet Michael himself remained missing. That evening, investigators examined his phone, which had been recovered from a side pocket. The battery was dead, but technicians managed to retrieve several audio recordings. Most were ordinary trail notes, weather observations, wildlife sightings, simple things hikers often record for themselves. Then they found the final file. The timestamp showed it being recorded shortly after midnight on the 2nd night of his trip. The audio began with Michael whispering. He sounded nervous. He explained that someone had been walking around his campsite for hours. At first, he assumed it was another hiker, but according to him, the footsteps never got closer and never moved farther away. They simply circled, constantly, as if something was walking laps around his tent. The recording captured the sound clearly. Leaves crunching, slow footsteps, one step after another, always maintaining the same distance. Then the footsteps stopped. For nearly a minute, there was complete silence. Suddenly, Michael whispered something that immediately caught everyone's attention. "Why are there lights out there?" A few seconds later, the audio picked up faint voices. Not words, just distant murmurs drifting through the forest. Michael unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The quality of the recording improved immediately. Investigators later estimated there were at least 6 separate light sources visible based on Michael's descriptions. He repeatedly compared them to lanterns moving between trees. Yet there were no reports of other campers in the area. The lights appeared to be slowly approaching his campsite. Michael's breathing became increasingly rapid as he described them. Then, one of the lights stopped. According to his recording, whoever carried it was standing just beyond the trees watching him. The voices stopped at the same moment. Silence returned. Then came a sound that nobody on the search team could explain. A bell. One clear ring echoing through the mountains. The instant it sounded, every voice disappeared. Every light vanished. Michael could be heard, turning in circles trying to find them. Then the bell rang again, this time much closer. His breathing became panicked. Branches snapped nearby. Something moved through the darkness. Michael began running. For the next several minutes, the recording captured nothing but in heavy breathing and crashing footsteps as he fled through the forest. Several times the bell sounded again, each ring closer than the last. Then, abruptly, Michael stopped. The final minute of the recording remains one of the strangest pieces of audio I've ever heard. Michael was no longer running. He sounded confused rather than frightened. He repeatedly asked the same question. "How did I get here?" Over and over. Then he whispered something investigators initially missed. "There are people standing between the trees." The audio picked up faint movement, not footsteps. More like clothing, shifting. Dozens of subtle sounds surrounding him from every direction. Michael's voice dropped to a whisper. "They're holding lanterns." For nearly 30 seconds he said nothing else. Then the bell rang one final time. Extremely close. So close it sounded, as if it were directly beside him. Immediately afterward, the recording ended. Search teams spent another 8 days combing the area. Helicopters searched valleys. Drones surveyed ridges. Dogs followed every possible scent trail. Nothing. Michael Foster was never found. Officially, the case remains unsolved. But 6 months later, while reviewing old reports from that region, one investigator discovered something unsettling. Over the last 70 years, there had been 11 separate disappearances within a 20-mile radius of where Michael vanished. In 7 of those cases, witnesses reported seeing strange lights moving through the forest at night, shortly before someone disappeared. And in 3 of them, the final thing anyone reported hearing was the sound of a bell ringing somewhere deep in the Appalachian Mountains. Story 10. The last photograph was taken at 2:17 a.m. That's the detail investigators always mention first. Not where it was found, not what appeared in it, just the time. Because according to every witness statement, the person who took that should have been asleep inside a locked fire tower, miles away from where the image was captured. My name is Logan Pierce, and in the autumn of 2022, I accepted a temporary position helping document the condition of several abandoned fire towers scattered throughout a remote section of the Appalachian Mountains in North Carolina. Most of the towers had been retired decades earlier and rarely saw visitors anymore. My job was straightforward. Hike to each location, photograph the structure, record its condition, and move on. The assignment sounded perfect. I loved isolated places, and few places are more isolated than the high ridges of the Appalachians. of the Appalachians in late October. The first 4 days passed without incident. The weather was clear, the forests were beautiful, and the work was easy. On the 5th day, however, I reached a tower locals had repeatedly warned me about. It wasn't famous. It didn't appear in guidebooks. In fact, most maps barely acknowledged its existence. The tower stood alone on a narrow ridge surrounded by dense forest and steep drop-offs. According to local residents, nobody stayed there overnight anymore. When I asked why, the answers were always vague. Some people simply shrugged. Others told me strange things happened after dark. One elderly man at a gas station looked me directly in the eye and said, "If you hear someone climbing the stairs after midnight, don't look down." Then he refused to explain further. Naturally, I assumed it was just another mountain legend. I reached the tower shortly before sunset. It was old but structurally sound, standing above the surrounding treetops like a rusted skeleton. After photographing the exterior, I decided to spend the night in the observation room at the top. The view was incredible, and it would save me several hours of hiking the next morning. As darkness settled over the mountains, the forest below disappeared, beneath a blanket of blackness. There were no towns visible from the tower, no roads, no lights, just endless wilderness, stretching in every direction. Around 11 p.m., I settled into my sleeping bag and eventually fell asleep. Sometime after midnight, I woke to the sound of metal creaking beneath me. At first, I assumed it was the tower shifting in the wind. Then I realized there was no wind. The sound came again, a single metallic clang echoing from below. Then another. Slowly, I became aware of a pattern. Someone was climbing the stairs. The old spiral staircase wrapped around the outside of the tower, and each step produced a distinct sound. Clang, paw clang, pause clang. Whoever it was moved slowly and deliberately. I checked my watch. 12:43 a.m. My first thought was that another hiker had found the tower and needed shelter. I stood and walked toward the doorway leading to the exterior platform. The sound immediately stopped. Complete silence returned. I waited several minutes before stepping outside with my flashlight. The staircase was empty. No movement, no lights below, nothing. Feeling embarrassed, I returned inside. 10 minutes later, the climbing resumed. Clang, pause. Clang, pause. Clang. This time, it continued for several minutes. Whoever's ascending seemed much closer now. I remembered the warning from the gas station and, despite myself, felt a knot form in my stomach. Still, curiosity eventually won. I stepped outside again and approached the railing. The sound continued beneath me. Someone was definitely climbing. Slowly, I pointed my flashlight downward. The beam illuminated the staircase, winding into darkness. There was nobody there. Yet the sounds continued exactly as before. Step after step, closer and closer. The realization hit me like ice water. Whatever was making the noise wasn't visible. I backed away immediately. The climbing continued for another 20 minutes before abruptly stopping just below the observation room. Not on the staircase beneath it, directly below it, as though whoever or whatever had reached the top. The rest of the night passed in silence. I didn't sleep again, The moment sunrise arrived, I packed my equipment and prepared to leave. Before descending, I reviewed the photographs on my camera. Most were exactly what I expected. Images of the tower, forests, ridgelines. Then I found one photograph I had never taken. The timestamp read 2:17 a.m. The image showed the tower itself, viewed from a distance among the trees. It was impossible. The photograph had been taken from the ground at least 200 yards away. Yet I had spent the entire night at the top of the structure. What disturbed me even more was what appeared in the observation room window. At first, I assumed it was me, but after zooming in, I realized the figure was facing the wrong direction. While the photograph showed the figure looking outward through the glass, I had been asleep, or at least I thought I was, facing the opposite wall at that exact time. The image became even stranger after investigators enhanced it. The figure in the tower wasn't alone. Standing around the base of the structure were dozens of dark silhouettes arranged in a perfect circle, all looking upward toward the observation room. None of them appeared in any of the other photographs. None left footprints, and according to the timestamp, all of them were there. At 2:17 in the morning, while I slept above them, completely unaware. I finished the assignment the next day and never returned to that section of the Appalachian Mountains. But sometimes, usually when I'm reviewing old photographs, I open that image again. Every time I do, I notice something new. There was a second figure standing beside the one in the tower window, a figure that definitely wasn't there the first time I looked. Story 11. The radio transmission lasted only 43 seconds, but it changed the entire search operation. Before that message came through, everyone believed we were looking for a lost hiker. Afterward, nobody was sure what we were dealing with anymore. My name is Derek Holloway, and in the spring of 2023, I worked with a volunteer rescue group that assisted local authorities in remote sections of the Appalachian Mountains. Over the years, I'd participated in dozens of searches, and while some situations were tragic, they were usually understandable. People got injured, they got lost. Sometimes they made bad decisions. The case of Emily Turner was different from the very beginning. Emily was a 28-year-old backpacker who had been hiking alone through a remote section of the Appalachian Mountains in western North Carolina. According to her itinerary, she planned to spend 4 days on the trail before returning to her vehicle at a designated trailhead. When she failed to arrive, her family contacted authorities. Initially, nobody was overly concerned. Delayed hikers are common in the Appalachians. Weather changes, navigation errors, minor injuries. There are countless reasons someone might arrive late. But when 2 more days passed without any sign of Emily, a full-scale search was launched. I joined on the 3rd day. The terrain was challenging, consisting of steep ridges, deep hollows, and dense forests that blocked visibility in every direction. Search teams spread out across miles of wilderness, checking shelters, campsites, and old logging roads. For 2 days we found absolutely nothing. Then late on the 5th afternoon, a ranger monitoring emergency frequencies picked up a radio transmission. It came from Emily's handheld emergency radio. The signal was weak and distorted, but it was definitely her voice. Every person at the command post stopped what they were doing to listen. At first, Emily sounded exhausted. She repeatedly stated her name and explained that she was lost. Then her tone changed. She began whispering. Investigators later enhanced the recording, and what she said next still gives me chills. "They're following the lights," she whispered. "Please don't send anyone after the lights." The dispatcher attempted to respond, but Emily continued speaking as if she couldn't hear him. She said she'd been seeing lights moving through the forest every night, small lights resembling lanterns drifting silently between trees. According to her, they always appeared shortly after sunset and remained visible until dawn. The dispatcher asked if she could describe who was carrying them. There was a long pause before Emily answered, "Nobody." Then Emily whispered something even stranger. "The lights are carrying themselves." At that moment, the transmission became distorted. Static crackled through the speaker. Emily's breathing grew rapid. Then she spoke one final sentence. "They're standing outside." The transmission ended immediately afterward. Search teams mobilized toward the source of the signal. By nightfall, several groups had reached the area where the radio message originated. We expected to find Emily injured, frightened, maybe suffering from exposure. Instead, we found her campsite. The tent was still standing. Her backpack was inside. Food supplies remained untouched. There was no sign of a struggle, no indication she had packed up and left voluntarily. It looked as though she had simply vanished. While investigators examined the site, one ranger discovered something unusual surrounding the tent. Hundreds of circular impressions covered the ground. Each impression was roughly the size of a dinner plate and formed concentric rings extending into the forest. Nobody could determine what created them. They weren't footprints. They weren't animal tracks. They looked more like places where heavy objects had rested briefly before being lifted away. The search continued for another week. Every day teams combed valleys and ridges looking for clues. Then strange reports began filtering back from volunteers. Several people claimed they saw lights moving through the forest after dark. Others reported hearing faint voices, despite finding nobody nearby. One experienced tracker abandoned his assigned search area after insisting something had been walking parallel to him for nearly an hour without making a sound. Officially, these reports were dismissed as stress and exhaustion. Unofficially, many of us were becoming uneasy. On the 10th night, my team established a temporary camp near a remote ridge. Around 1 am I woke and noticed several lights drifting among the trees below. At first I assumed they belonged to another search group, but there was something wrong about the way they moved. They floated, not high above the ground, only a few feet, but enough to be noticeable. More disturbing was their silence. No voices accompanied them, no footsteps, no sounds at all. Just pale lights weaving slowly through the darkness. I watched for nearly a minute before waking the others. By the time they looked, the lights were gone. The following morning, we discovered a fresh set of circular impressions surrounding our tents, exactly like those found around Emily's campsite. 2 weeks later, the search was officially suspended. Emily Turner was never found. But the strangest detail emerged months afterward. when technicians performed a deeper analysis of the radio transmission. Hidden beneath Emily's voice were additional sounds previously missed because of the static. At first, investigators thought they were environmental noises. Then someone isolated the audio. There were voices, dozens of them, quiet whispers, speaking simultaneously in the background. None matched Emily's voice. None sounded close to the radio. Yet, during the final seconds of the transmission, just before it ended, every one of those voices spoke the same 3 words. At exactly the same time, she sees us. Story 12. Most people think the Appalachian Mountains are dangerous because of the weather, the wildlife, or the sheer isolation. They're wrong. Those things can kill you, sure, but at least they follow rules. What happened to me didn't. My name is Grant Sullivan, and for nearly 10 years, I worked as a surveyor, mapping remote areas throughout the Appalachian Mountains. My job regularly took me far beyond established trails, into places few people ever visited.
I had spent countless nights alone in the wilderness and never experienced anything I couldn't explain.
Until October of 2024, the assignment seemed simple enough. A private conservation group needed updated maps of a remote valley in eastern Tennessee, an area so isolated that even modern GPS coverage was unreliable. I was scheduled to spend 4 days documenting old access roads, streams, and terrain features before returning to civilization. The first day went smoothly. The second day was strange. The third day was when everything went wrong. It started shortly after sunset. I had established camp beside a narrow creek running through the center of the valley. The surrounding ridges were steep and densely forested, blocking most moonlight from reaching the ground. Around 9 p.m., I noticed something unusual on my GPS device. A trail appeared on the screen that wasn't there earlier. At first, I assumed it was a software glitch. GPS units occasionally display incorrect data, but when I checked my paper maps, I found something even stranger. A faint path was marked there as well. The trail seemed to run directly through the center of the valley before ending at a location labeled only with a small black circle. I had studied those maps for days and never noticed it before. Curiosity got the better of me. The following morning, I decided to investigate. The trail was real, narrow and heavily overgrown, but definitely there. Judging by its condition, it hadn't been used in decades. The farther I followed it, the quieter the forest became. Eventually, I reached the location marked by the black circle. What I found there made no sense. Hidden among the trees stood an entire village. Not a modern village, an old one. Dozens of wooden structures surrounded a central clearing. Some buildings had partially collapsed, but many remained standing. There were no roads leading in or out, no signs explaining the site, no evidence that tourists or historians ever visited. It looked abandoned, yet somehow preserved. I spent nearly an hour exploring. Everything felt wrong. Not dangerous exactly, just wrong. The houses contained furniture. Tools rested where people had left them. Plates still sat on tables. It looked as though everyone had stood up and walked away at the same moment. Then I found the church. Unlike the other buildings, the church door stood open. Inside, every pew faced the rear wall instead of the altar. The arrangement was so bizarre. that I stopped in the doorway, trying to understand what I was seeing. That's when I noticed the writing carved into the wood behind the pulpit. Hundreds of names covered the wall. Thousands, maybe. Layer on layer of carved names stretching from floor to ceiling. At the center was a single sentence. If they know your name, leave before dark. I should have turned around right then. Instead, I kept exploring. By the time I finally left the village, the sun was already sinking behind the mountains. The hike back felt longer than it should have. The forest seemed unfamiliar. Despite following the same trail, shadows stretched between the trees, and several times I had the distinct feeling that someone was walking behind me. Whenever I stopped, the sensation disappeared. I reached camp shortly after sunset and tried convincing myself the village was simply an abandoned settlement, forgotten by time. Then the voices started. At first they were faint, almost impossible to hear above the sound of the creek. Then they became clearer, people whispering somewhere beyond the trees. Not one voice, dozens, maybe hundreds. The whispers drifted through the darkness surrounding my campsite. Occasionally I could make out individual words. Most meant nothing. Then I heard my name, quietly, softly. Grant! I froze. A few seconds later it came again. Grant! From a different direction. The voices multiplied, one after another, whispering my name from every side of the valley. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it across the trees. Nothing. The whispers stopped immediately. The moment I lowered the light, they resumed. For hours, the voices continued, never shouting, never approaching, just speaking my name over and over. Sometime after midnight, I heard movement near the creek, footsteps. I shined my flashlight toward the sound and saw figures standing on the opposite bank. There were at least 20 of them, maybe more. None moved, none spoke. They simply stood there watching. The beam illuminated their outlines, but revealed no faces. The moment I blinked, they were gone. By dawn, I had packed everything. I didn't stop to rest. Several times I heard voices behind me. Several times I thought I saw figures among the trees. I never looked directly at them. I reached my vehicle shortly before sunset and left the mountains with looking back. Months later, I tried locating the village again, using my survey notes and GPS data. The coordinates led to an empty valley. No trail, no buildings, no church, nothing. It was as if the entire place had never existed. The conservation group reviewed my maps and informed me that no settlement had ever been recorded in that area. Officially, there was nothing there. But every now and then, usually late at night, I'll receive a call from an unknown number. When I answer, nobody speaks. I hear only faint whispers on the other end. And every single time, just before the line disconnects, one voice quietly says my name. I see you in the next video.